Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us again for our Case for the Old Testament class. We took a couple weeks off in our summer class here, and now we're back with a new session. And during that period of time, if you're following along on a weekly basis, we recommended highly that you watch the Moses controversy documentary by Patterns of Evidence, Timothy Mahony's Patterns of Evidence series that addresses some of the really, I think, critical questions and skepticism that's in the culture today about, of course, about the Bible, the skepticism that always exists in culture concerning God and the Bible, Jesus, Holy Spirit, the whole Christian worldview that is really under attack today. And so I think the biggest purpose of this class is really to equip Christians and also to inform those who might be checking Christianity out, but to equip Christians in defense of the faith and to give confidence to Christians that what we believe to be true is really true. And we can look at evidence, and we can look at God's word, and we can look at how all of these things line up. And it's not by coincidence that science, history, archaeology, even literature supports the Bible as a unique piece of work and documentation. And it's been amazing over the years, if you truly look at the history of the Bible, how much discoveries have supported what has been written for centuries, for millennia in the Bible. And it's fun. It's fun to really explore that and to kind of go, wow, aha, wow, this is amazing. And so so much of that is I think based on just a lack of knowledge by Christians today, to really a lack of dedication and passion, and just taking some time to really look in and dive into what it is we believe as Christians. Because again, if we're going to call ourselves a Christian, we should have a Christian worldview. That doesn't mean we're saying, hey, we're perfect, we're better than other people, by no means. In fact, really true Christians usually are at the rock bottom in life, in this life, because of just the way the world is. The world is fallen. We're fallen people. And as Christians, what we're doing is we're putting our hope in Jesus and what he's done and what our Bible teaches us about that history leading up to the person of Jesus. And I think that's exciting. And I think as Christians, we should be excited to dive in and learn about what it is that we claim to be, and what the history is, and why Jesus did what he did. Can you answer that question? Why did Jesus go to the cross? Why did he have to do that? And why is it important for us to put our faith and trust in that? And so, I think a lot of times we don't have those answers. And as I've shared before, that was my dilemma early on in my life, was that other Christians didn't have answers to those tough questions that I was asking and others are asking. And I think it's, again, important for us to look for those answers and to be able to provide those answers to others. Sometimes we don't like the answers. Sometimes other people don't want to hear the answers, but the answers are out there. The truth is out there, and truth can be known. And that's, I think, an important thing in our culture today to understand as well. And so before we get started, let's go ahead and open in prayer, and then I'll get into the presentation for this evening. Father, thank you for this time that we can spend together studying your word and talking about you and learning about you, and gaining confidence in what we believe to be true, and that what we believe to be true about the Bible, about you, is based on reality, is based on things that match up with reality. And we are so grateful that you have been not only willing to give us your word to study, but to give us for us stubborn people to give us outside evidence that helps corroborate what you've taught us in your word in the Bible. And so we're so grateful for that. And we pray that we have the passion and desire to share what we're learning with others. And we want to remember to do that as representatives of yours, to do that with gentleness and respect, but to also have the confidence in knowing that we have what is really true. We have the truth, and the truth sets us free, as you tell us and teach us. And so we thank you for this time again together. We pray for the Holy Spirit to bless our time. And we thank you, Jesus, for what you did to make all of this possible. And it's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. Thank you. All right. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to pick up where we left off. As far as a class goes, we do this class live in person, but then it's also offered here online on the website, truthfaithandreason.com. You can go there to get like overview notes and Bible study questions and that kind of thing. I also post this YouTube video there as well. So you might be watching on YouTube, you might be going to the website and watching from there. And so we encourage you to do this class, maybe if you're not in the in-person class, maybe doing it with a small group, maybe a few neighbors or friends. If you're doing it on your own, that's good too, but it's always important. I believe strongly that it's very important to be in community with other Christians. And so, and again, as Christians, we're called to share our faith with others. And so if you bring others in and share some of these things that we're learning, maybe do the study together, that would be awesome. And so we're on session 4. Joseph's brothers come to Egypt. And what we do each week is that I review, at least for this class anyways, I review the questions. We look at a few of the deeper things and some of the apologetic things that go into the subject. And then there's Bible study questions for you to do to prepare for next week. And so within your group, you can study together. And then you can double check answers as I go over them in the presentation. And you can always feel free to share answers with me by going to the website and in the comment section, putting in any of the things or questions that you might have or other answers that you've come across that might help the study. I always welcome that as well. All right. So one of the things we've been doing each week is taking some time at the beginning of the class, and you can hit pause, and actually don't do that yet because I'm going to ask you to just do number 3 and 4 this week. And so one of the things we do, so I'm gonna skip and erase numbers 1 and 2, which we've been practicing, and we will go back to memorizing the books of the Old Testament and New Testament if you want, and also knowing major players, events, and covenants. But I want to focus in this week on numbers 3 and 4. Adding in number 4, and we talked about these. If you don't have those answers with you, they're in the notes from the first session for this summer class. So the big picture of the Bible, there's 12 points to remember, and then we added what are the 8 most important focus points to watch for when studying the Old Testament. These 2 things will help you when you're reading through the Old Testament, and especially if you move on past where our study is going to go through Exodus, if you get on into the other books of the Old Testament, knowing the big picture and understanding some focus points, you might want to even call them themes or major big ideas about what you're reading in the Bible, I think are very important. So if you could take a few minutes and hit pause and then come on back after you've done that. There's also a memory verse there, and I'll review that in just a minute with you. So take a few minutes with your group and do prayer and questions 3, 4, and read, recite, or if you've memorized the memory verse. This is a new one this week, so you don't have it yet to memorize. So we'll repeat it again next week. All right. And then if you've come back now, what I want to do is I just want to make a comment. The importance of knowing the big picture of the Bible and understanding, with those focus points to help you, but just understanding the storyline and the importance of what's going on in the Bible, because I think a lot of times people get hung up on like what happened in Leviticus and why all the sacrifices and what about all those laws and regulations. But if you fast forward to the New Testament, it's interesting that we find the Apostle Peter, Stephen, who was martyred for his faith, the Apostle Paul, and especially Jesus himself on the road to Emmaus, all recounted history to the people that they were witnessing to, that they were sharing the gospel with. They started with recounting the history. Now, this was important in Jewish culture for a Jewish person, especially if you were a rabbi or a teacher of any kind. But even I think probably, I'm not 100% sure, but a mature, strong Jewish believer would have known their history. It was always reviewed and talked about. And so if Jesus did that on the road to Emmaus, because it says on that, and you know what, I don't have those verses in front of me, but I think you could look them up. I've gone over them before, but I didn't jot them down. So I think it's in Luke, and I could be wrong. It could be in Matthew. It's either in Matthew or Luke, where Jesus, after the resurrection, he appears to a couple of his disciples who are walking on the road to Emmaus. That's why it's called the road to Emmaus when he discusses it. And it says he gives them a whole, like basically a whole teaching from the Old Testament that shows and points to who he was, why he came, why he had to do what he did, and what the results were. And they were amazed. But so if you read that and you kind of do that as a research piece, maybe look those up. But I think that's amazing that we have examples like that in the New Testament. And I think we should glean from that as we talk to people about the gospel. People want to know why. Why should I believe what you are telling me? And if we can go back and say, all of the Old Testament points to Jesus. This is God's original plan from, the beginning. He created everything perfect. Then we had the fall, and God created a rescue plan for us at that moment to be able to bring us back to him. And that's, the whole kind of the quick big picture of the Old Testament is God working out that plan, coming to the person of Jesus. That's exciting when we can see that happening in the Old Testament. Now, I want to say about this memory verse, I'm going to read it. And I picked the NLT, the New Living Translation, on that one. And it says, you have been believers so long now that you ought to be teachers or teaching others. Let me pause. I want to make a point there. This verse is one I picked to put in here because it emphasizes the importance of, as a Christian, if you've been a Christian for a long time and you haven't been teaching others, it doesn't mean that you have a classroom and you're teaching people, but it does mean that you are sharing your faith and you're leading others, maybe within your own church, in your own family, in your neighborhood, in your group of friends. Our scripture tells us, and this is the writer of Hebrews is telling his audience who are Christians that they need to be teaching others. So let's read it, understanding that perspective. It says, you have been believers so long now that you ought to be teaching others. Instead, you need someone to teach you again the basic things about God's word. You are like babies who need milk and cannot eat solid food. For someone who lives on milk is still an infant and doesn't know how to do what is right. Solid food is for those who are mature, who through training, have the skill to recognize the difference between right and wrong. Now, I like it in the NLT because it really just keeps it simple for us in the language there. And he's saying to other believers, you've been a believer for a long time now. You need to be teaching others. But what he's finding, and I think this is very appropriate to our culture today, what he's finding is believers all over the place who have no idea about what they believe and they can't share it with others. Instead, they need to just keep going and getting fed, what they call sit and get in education. They just want to sit and get. And that's what, if you're going to church once a week, that's great. But are you just sitting and getting, and then you're not trying to share that with others? And if you feel that you need deeper teaching, then you should find a way to do that. This class is one of those, but there's many out there, many different ways that you can just study the word and go a little bit deeper. So, think about that. Take a little reflection as to where you are in your journey of life as a Christian. And, have you taken another step forward and if you're a new Christian, you could sit and get, for some time, but keep in mind that what you want to do is learn enough to be able to share with others and be confident in sharing what you know to be true with others. All right. So I'm going to leave that there. We'll review that memory verse again next week. It's actually a couple verses in Hebrews. All right. So getting into our last study, you guys did as a homework assignment, chapters 43 to 46 in Genesis. So what I want to do is go through and review that. One of the things that is in the questions, and here's the questions if you didn't have them. But the first thing I always put there is to review the class topic, which is kind of the apologetics piece or the presentation. And so we've been using the Moses controversy for that as far as the apologetics piece. And we've been taking a look at Timothy Mahony's Patterns of Evidence documentary called The Moses Controversy. And I hope everyone had a chance to watch that in some way or another. And because we're going to do another one from him as we're getting into the book of Exodus. But Patterns of Evidence, The Moses Controversy, about 2 hours long. And one of the things I want to just do right now, since we're pretty much done with it, is that I want to just review a few important things about that documentary with you in case you didn't get a chance to see it, or if you did, hopefully maybe these are some things you picked up on. So it's just been in the last century or so that modern academia has embraced this skepticism. Moses didn't write the Bible, the Torah. Moses didn't write the Torah, the first 5 books, is what they want to say. But it's just been, in recent history to the point, and the skepticism has escalated to the point of admonishing those who hold to the traditional historical thinking about the Bible, and particularly the first 5 books. But is that skepticism warranted in spite of the evidence? Because there's good evidence out there to believe that what the Bible teaches and the traditional historical view of Moses being the author is true. So mainstream science, some of the skepticism that's out there includes mainstream science saying things like, well, science doesn't have to prove the Bible kinds of things anymore. Like archaeology doesn't go out and prove the Bible stuff. It's not necessarily true. They make the claim that the Bible exaggerates. For example, they say things like Solomon wasn't that great, David didn't really do all those things, and there's too many fantastical narratives like the parting of the Red Sea. This is their skepticism, forgetting that there is a God who is supernatural. Another thing is they believe the Torah is a product of earlier unreliable or oral tradition. So they call oral tradition unreliable, which again is not true. And many scholars claim that there are much later multiple authors. This is known as the documentary hypothesis. Mainstream historians place Egyptian history in a different time period than traditional biblical history does. So that's an important one that we're going to really kind of play out a little bit in the next few classes. What about the dating of the Exodus? Mainstream thought is that widespread literacy was not possible in the biblical time period of the Exodus, and that there was no form of writing that had an alphabet until the time of the Phoenicians, which is hundreds of years later. Well, we're going to see, if you watch that video, that all of those things are really debunked. Most of the mainstream scholars that deny Moses' authorship consider themselves, and I think this is important, they consider themselves agnostic or atheists. You see this in the video. And most of these mainstream scholars hold to paradigms that their professors developed and taught, rather than being willing to look at alternative possibilities and new evidences. They are married to or invested in the models in place. And we talk about the paradigms quite a bit that are in place in academia. I've talked about that much before. And they're very much married to that documentary hypothesis. Now, there are, however, many biblical scholars that do hold and strongly believe in the traditional historical view of Moses' authorship. There is much evidence that destroys the documentary hypothesis, and Timothy Mahony presents this in the documentary. The following is an outline style overview of the evidence presented in the film, The Moses Controversy, and I'm going to just give you a few points here. And viewing of the complete documentary is highly recommended. And this was on last week's website. I put some notes in that gave some details to these answers. So if you go to the website, you can actually see a lot of these things that I have here. So patterns of evidence, what they investigated, they did an investigative criteria that states if Moses wrote the Torah, as the Bible claims, then there should be evidence for the following questions. Was there a form of writing by the time of the Exodus? And the answer was yes. Yes. And he goes through all of that in the documentary. Was there a form of writing available in the region of Egypt? Yes, again. And all of that's been discovered in modern recent times. Was there a form of an alphabet available by the time of the Exodus? Again, the answer is yes. They have now discovered a very early Proto-Hebraic type alphabet. And was there a form of writing similar to Hebrew? Again, yes, actual Hebrew. It can be read, it can be seen in the letters, in the inscriptions. Excuse me. Now, I have a few notes that let me go over really quick to support these claims. So if you didn't see the documentary or you want to, just hear a few things, there's an abundance of biblical support for Moses' authorship. So all throughout the Old and New Testament, there's references always back to Moses' writings and Moses himself being the author. Jesus claims, for example, in John 5, verses 46 and 47, that he says something to the, I'll paraphrase, that, if you don't believe Moses and his writings, how will you ever believe me? So he's basically saying, you guys, you read the books of Moses all the time. He's speaking about Moses being the author. So if you didn't believe Moses, how can you believe me? Moses pointed to Jesus coming, is what he said. Exodus 7:14 is an example of Moses writing, but that's within the text, proving the text. And I know that can be an argument. But the interesting thing is the Bible being 66 books, 40 authors over a long period of time, is that they're separate books, yet they corroborate each other. They complement each other. They talk about the same thing. And in many of those books, Moses is indicated as the author of the Torah. So there's a lot of evidence just within the books themselves. There are writing systems available by the time of the Exodus and in the region of Egypt. And we have the evidence in hieroglyphics, cuneiform, and an early alphabetic script termed the Proto-Sinaitic or Proto-Canaanite script, which is Semitic. It's Semitic script that Hebrew is part of. And this early script, in some scholars' view, can actually be termed Proto-Hebraic or Hebrew 1, with a later form developing Hebrew 2 and finally into the Old Hebrew, which would be Hebrew 3. Now, archaeology finds of early documentations confirm no real changes were ever made to the Torah, especially when we look at things like the Dead Sea Scrolls dated 200 BC approximate. And the Book of Numbers has a silvered amulet dated much earlier, like about 600 BC. Thus, the belief in traditional Moses authorship is long-standing, has not been changed over time. So it's not like something someone added in, in more modern times or whatever. Only an eyewitness could record the details given in the Torah. For example, Specific cultural practices, geography, and individual names are all found in there. Only things that someone who lived during that time period would know, not later authors. Oral tradition was reliable as it was community-oriented and self-correcting. So it would have added to Moses' knowledge along with his highly sophisticated training growing up as a son of Pharaoh in Egypt. So there's more there for support for oral transmission, even up to the time of the printing press. There are many literary scholars that say oral tradition is very, very reliable because it's self-correcting, community-oriented. People who knew would correct someone who's making the mistake. Newer archaeological discoveries are showing that widespread literacy was prominent, and Moses' command for the people to write on their doorposts. If you know anything about the Bible, at the time of the Exodus, the Passover, they were to write on their doorposts and teach their children and give insight so that they would know. And so these are some really good things, I think, that will help determine validity. Now, there's a few more things I want to share about the documentary in case you don't get a chance to see it. But again, I encourage you to watch it if you can. In part 2, so the second hour of the Moses controversy, Mahony proposes the question, and he kind of goes a little farther on his criteria, and he states that, or he asked the question, could the earliest alphabetic script, known as the Proto-Sinaitic script, and that's what even secular scholars will agree to call it, could that script really be Hebrew? And if so, then who invented that script? There are 3 criteria questions that need to be researched, and Mahony found a resounding yes to all 3 of these as he goes on in part 2. And what I think is interesting is that when you actually do the legwork, like Mahony did, he interviewed the skeptical scholars and found out what their reasonings were, and he shows it all in the documentary. And then he goes out and really does some of the legwork himself. He interviews biblical scholars that do hold to Moses' authorship and the timings and all of that as being the traditional historical ways to look at it. And so what he does is he digs a little bit deeper, and he asks these 3 questions and finds an answer yes to all of these. Does it match the look of Hebrew? So does that early script look like Hebrew? The answer is yes. Is it readable as Hebrew? And so what he does is take it to rabbi scholars who can look at it and say, yeah, I can read it as Hebrew. And that is really important, because if it looks like Hebrew, if it's readable like Hebrew, then why isn't it just called the earliest Hebrew? And I think a lot of that has to do with people just not wanting it to be that the Hebrew is the earliest form of writing that we have in our human history. But I think if you really look at this evidence, it really points in that direction. And the last question he wanted to use as a criteria was, does it match the history of the Israelites? And the answer is yes, but again, that is another sticking point in secular academia with skeptics, is the actual dating of the Exodus. And so that's something we're going to look at as we get into our next few classes down the road. Now, I want to mention, let's see, I had one more thing I wanted to say. Well, it has to do with who really wrote this. And he goes out on a limb, I think, in terms of presenting this possibility. But if all of it matches up, if the dating in particular is right on with the biblical time period, with the history of the Israelites in the early Exodus that matches the biblical criterias, then you have to answer this final question about the person who wrote it or developed it. And this would have to have been somebody, and the question would be, who would have been responsible for developing this early script? There would have had to have been a motive. It had to be a person that had a motive or a need for an alphabet that was readable and transportable. That's an important piece too. Earliest inscriptions are found during the reign of the Pharaoh of Joseph's time. So the 12th dynasty. And this is again in the earlier dating of the Exodus and this time period of Joseph. So they've found these inscriptions. A severe famine is also recorded during this time period, historically outside of the Bible. Communication with the people of the region would have been vital, as stated in the biblical record. So we've got this need for communication during this famine period, and as we're reading about it in Genesis and Exodus, that time period crossover there from this point of Joseph's time, we see that this style of script is found in Egypt during this period of time with Joseph, and on through the Exodus. They find it there. Then it shows up in Canaan after the biblical period of the Exodus. Interesting time frame. Of course, secular scholars won't cop to this or admit this because they have a different dating based on some other things that we'll talk about in some future classes. The prototype to the Phoenician script is in Israel before it's in Phoenicia. That's interesting too. Coincidentally, is in this time period that King Solomon was communicating with Hiram for the building of the temple. So there's a lot of things that line up there as, I think, very strong possibilities for this conclusion. God inspired this early alphabetic script, and Joseph would have been the one used by God who was in the position to write instructively. So the very first time this huge need for mass communication would have been during Joseph's time. Joseph had the motive and the need for this method, mass communication method, during the famine and then beyond. This practice would have continued for the next 400 years to the time of Moses, who would easily have used this method to be able to write the Torah. So I would throw that out as being a very strong possibility. Is it 100% provable? No. But it's just interesting to me that if there's any evidence that supports God's word and supports who God is and what God has done over the history of time, and what Jesus said, it just seems to me that if there's evidence there at all, it gives validity to what we believe to be true. And so I think that's what's exciting. If there was no evidence and it was so far out of the ballpark that it was even possible, then I think, yeah, you could reasonably question, but that God gives us evidence beyond what he writes in scripture, he doesn't have to do that, but he does. And I think that's what's really cool. So I'll just leave that there. We are going to continue using Mahony's patterns of evidence for when we get into the Exodus. All right. So what I want to do is kind of review those other questions just to finish off presentation today. So this is in Genesis 43 from our last meeting and the last time you did some homework here. So question 2, in this chapter, Jacob finally agrees to send the brothers back to Egypt with Benjamin. The famine was still severe at this point. What happened between Jacob and his sons concerning going back to Egypt with Benjamin? What did Judah say in verses 8 and 9? And what does this say about Judah's character at this point compared to his previous behavior? And then discuss what happened when Joseph saw the brothers again, this time with Benjamin, and how does his reaction relate to his character? All right, so let's break this down into the little chunks of questions there. And again, what I do, you don't need this here, but I just want to show you, what I like to do is copy and paste the passage I'm studying or the chapter, and I like to read through it and highlight and underline and do some things like that help me then formulate answers to the questions to be specific. And so what about Jacob and the brothers, okay, his sons? The famine had become even more severe, and Jacob's family had again run out of grain, so it would be necessary to go back to Egypt, or else they would starve. And if you remember, we left off last time with Joseph keeping Simeon and telling him to go get your brother Benjamin and come back again. And then he would release Simeon. So this has probably been quite a long period of time, because now they've run out of food, and Jacob's kind of stuck as far as they're either going to starve to death or he's going to have to send them back. But Jacob did not want to send Benjamin, but Judah convinced him that would be the only way to get the food. So Jacob gave in, saying, if I am bereaved, I'm bereaved, because he knows there's no other choice. So Jacob sent gifts with the brothers to give to the governor Joseph, not knowing it's his son Joseph, including double the money, because they had previously returned with their original money in their sacks, not knowing that Joseph had been responsible for that. And so Jacob decides he has no choice but to send Benjamin. And if he's bereaved if something happens to him. Now, Judah actually steps up at this point. Judah has a change in his character that we can see. In verses 8 and 9, Judah says to his father, send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, we as well as you and our little ones. I myself, notice what he says, I myself will be surety for him. You may hold me responsible for him if I do not bring him back to you and set him before you. Then let me bear the blame before you forever. And so Judah is giving us a little bit of a picture here, a foreshadow of Jesus. He foreshadows Jesus here by putting himself as a sacrifice for Benjamin. This will also play out with Judah and Joseph a little later in the story. Now, Judah's character seems to be changing for the better, as he has gone from a selfish, self-centered person to a concerned, caring brother. And now Judah appears to be the best example of a leader in the family, and will continue to serve in that way on into the future, as reflected in his tribe and kingly descendants that we will see later on. Okay, moving on. Joseph's reaction to Benjamin. So now the brothers are back in Egypt, and they're going to meet Joseph. And Joseph, upon seeing his brothers and Benjamin, had his servants bring them into his house, and he gave them water, and they washed their feet, and he gave their donkeys fodder. Their brothers were, however, fearful and confessed about having found their money, or the money in their sacks, and offered the money Jacob had sent. But Joseph's aide told them in verse 23, your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. So he's telling them, you didn't cheat us or anything, I guess is what he's trying to say. And notice how Joseph's aide revered God, Joseph's God. And this could have only come from the example Joseph had set for him. And so we can see Joseph's influence in people around him in his story. It's really amazing. And how he always, honors God, and it seems to spill over into the people around him. Now, upon seeing Benjamin, specifically Joseph, was, it says, deeply stirred, and he sought a place to weep. So to still not give away who he is, he had to go and hide and kind of bawl his eyes out because he'd seen his brother now. Joseph served his brothers a meal. And this is interesting. He sat them in order from oldest to youngest, giving Benjamin 5 times the amount of food. And just a note there, this would have been nearly impossible for someone to guess, because many of the brothers were extremely close in age. Remember, they had different mothers, and they were born, a couple of them, I think, right after another, and some probably right near the same time, with having, Jacob having the 4 different wives, so to speak. Now, to put a special note in here relating to the question of the separation of the people, the setting of the meal was significant in several ways. So if you notice in this story, you have the brothers eating kind of separately from the Egyptians, and then there's Joseph that has to eat on his own. So Joseph, he was an Egyptian, he was a Semite, and a Hebrew. He had all kind of 3 of those characteristics. Joseph's men were Egyptian and most likely Hamites. Remember, we talked about that difference between the ruling class, which were Semites at this time, and the more common class in Egypt were Hamites, because they'd been overthrown by the Hyksos dynasty. The brothers were Hebrew Semites. Now, Hebrews were shepherds, even more, separation there because of that. And this was a loathsome, dirty kind of thing to Egyptians. They didn't see shepherds as being clean, or that they were equals at any sense. So all of this, there was different reasons they all had to sit separately, especially Joseph, as he fit all the categories, yet he was barred from them all at the same time. Interesting what we do in terms of class and culture, and sometimes race, of course, and ethnicity, and all of that causes us to do silly things. They could have all just sat and ate together, been no big deal, and not in God's economy. All right, question 3. Excuse me. In this chapter, Joseph sends the brothers out, but he has a plan to bring them back and test them one last time. What did Joseph do that seemed to doom the brothers, and how did they respond? How did Judah step up in this situation, and what did he say he would do? And then discuss, how do we see a picture of Jesus in Judah's recent actions? And so again, I take the passage, underline, highlight, do some things like that. And then I break it down for that answer, or answers. Joseph's final plan to test his brothers. All right. Joseph decides to test his brothers one more time by releasing them and placing his silver cup in the mouth of Benjamin's sack, and all of their money in each brother's sack. So he puts the money back in again, like he did last time. This time he puts a silver cup that's his in the mouth of Benjamin's sack. As soon as they left, Joseph sent his officials after them, and the officials accused them of theft. And upon searching their sacks, they found the silver cup of Joseph's in Benjamin's sack. So interesting that Joseph kind of sets up this whole thing to trap and kind of test the brothers to see how they're going to react, especially now that Benjamin was going to be the one found guilty. This offense would have been worthy of imprisonment and or death, and the brothers were all in shock at this point. They tore their clothes in grief and all returned to Joseph. They all returned. At this point, Joseph actually gave them the opportunity to leave and go back home without Benjamin, which was the ultimate. Well, it was ultimately the test. He was trying to see how they were going to treat Benjamin at this point because of how badly they had treated him. But Judah refused and said that they were all now Joseph's slaves. Judah redeems himself and his brothers a couple of ways here. Judah steps up by taking a chance and approaching Joseph. So just to go up and approach and talk to him could have cost him his life. He could have been struck down. Judah then recounts their family history, not knowing who Joseph really was, and tells him about their father and the supposed loss of Benjamin's full brother. He's speaking to the guy, and how it grieved his father. So this got to be hard for Joseph to hear Judah just making this huge confession and kind of remorsefully admitting everything. Judah is honest with Joseph and pleads with Joseph to take him in place of Benjamin so that his father would not die of grief. Note, Joseph most likely thought that he would save Benjamin, and this is one of those speculation things, but just think about it for how things were set up here. He was probably thinking he would save Benjamin from the brothers by keeping him in Egypt. He'd probably then reveal himself and keep him with him in Egypt and sending the brothers back, not knowing they were now remorseful. Judah seemed to have changed all of that with his confession and willingness to take Benjamin's place. So now Joseph sees the change of heart, especially in Judah. Probably also is concerned about his father Jacob as well. So Judah pictures Jesus. Judah becomes like a foreshadow of Jesus. We see this again all over the Old Testament. Remember I said knowing that big picture and understanding some of those focus points of the Old Testament helps us see that almost every story, I can't think of one that's not, almost every story, event, and even the main characters picture Jesus in some way or another. This is called a foreshadow. So it's giving us this view of what God is going to ultimately do through his son, Jesus. So again, Judah, he becomes a foreshadow of Jesus because he offers his life and the blame, the sin, for the father, Jacob, and for Benjamin, and then ultimately for all the brothers, the nation, when he goes before Joseph. So this can be seen as a pretty deep kind of picture and foreshadowing. Judah atones for all their sins by confessing and taking his life in place of theirs. Okay, so just kind of those couple of things there help us see that picture. Question 4. In this chapter, Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. What happened when Joseph revealed who he was? How did his brothers respond? And ultimately, how did Jacob react when he found out about his son being alive? And then what was the Pharaoh's response to all that happened? Because he's kind of gets in the picture again here. And then discuss, why do you think that the Pharaoh was so supportive of Joseph and his family? And what can we learn from Joseph's trusting relationship with God? So a lot in this question 4. Let's kind of break it down. Joseph finally reveals himself. So what happens here? Judah's confession, his honesty and willingness to take Benjamin's place, finally cracks Joseph, and he tells the brothers who he really is. And he weeps loudly as he does it, because they says they can hear him everywhere. The brothers are speechless and most likely trembling with fear, so for so many reasons. The text says they could not answer him and were dismayed. NIV says they were terrified, and NLT says they were stunned by Joseph's reassure. Okay, they were stunned, comma. But Joseph reassures them and shows his reverence and ultimate trust in God by saying, and this is an interesting passage, he says, "Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, it's only been 2 of the 7 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will neither be plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now, therefore, it was not you who sent me here, but God." So notice how prophetic this is, and the affirmation of Joseph's earlier dreams come out. It's just amazing that Joseph can have this attitude, but he understands God's big picture, that God sent him there, even though he had to go through some suffering and difficulties. I mean, how many times in our own lives do we feel like, why God, why am I suffering? Why am I going through this horrible thing that I'm going through? And then later on, we can look back in hindsight and we can see some reasons for it. Sometimes we don't see those reasons right away. And maybe even sometimes we won't see them at all until we're on the other side of this life. But God knows. And the big picture is important here, particularly in this story, because God has a plan of delivering not only that nation, but everyone in the future. And so it's important here for God to be able to display this in this story. And I think for us, and in hindsight, we could see that they didn't have that luxury of hindsight like we do. All right, Joseph finally reveals himself. A little bit more on that continued. Joseph tells the brothers to go and get his dad and the rest of their family and move to Goshen so that he can take care of them for the rest of the famine. Joseph and the brothers weep together, and Joseph sends them off with provisions. But for Benjamin and his father, he gave them 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. To his father, he sent 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and substance for his father on the journey. And the Pharaoh's response? It's extremely supportive. It's interesting how much he supports Joseph, in that he gave Joseph the needed supplies and the best place in the land for Joseph's family to come and live, in the land of Goshen. That's going to be an important area that we're going to talk about coming up in our future classes as we move into the study of the Exodus. So discuss Pharaoh's support and Joseph's relationship with God. So Pharaoh's support, we've talked a little bit about this. It can be explained in a few ways. God's sovereign hand, first of all, is guiding the events and the favor of Joseph in Pharaoh's eyes, setting up the nation of Israel to grow and flourish in Egypt, because this is a time that's going to come. Secondly, Joseph had proved to be a trustworthy co-regent for the Pharaoh, in that his dream interpretation came true, and he showed his skill in managing not only households, but the entire country. And 3, remembering that the Pharaoh at this time was of Semitic origin, as was Joseph and his family, they would have been seen as allies more than just foreigners, and therefore given some preferential treatment. So Joseph's relationship with God results in all of this good that's coming about, including the supportive ways of Pharaoh. God used Joseph for a greater good than that he did not see until many years later. Yet Joseph trusted God's plan and perfect timing. That's the thing we have to remember. It's not our timing, it's God's. Joseph's story teaches us that we sometimes don't see God's answer to our prayers right away. It may take many years, or even after we are gone. But like Joseph, we must have faith and trust in God and his word, knowing that he will never leave us or forsake us. Joseph was an example of how to live out our lives, trusting God, no matter the circumstances or multiple disappointments that we might face. In the end, God was and is in control and works all things for good, even though others may mean it for evil. And that's that verse in chapter 50, verse 20. Excuse me. All right, last question. In this chapter, chapter 46, Jacob, also known as Israel, follows God's instruction to move his entire family to Egypt during the famine. What did God say to Jacob concerning the move? How does this relate to the Abrahamic covenant? What part of the covenant does he address? Who did Jacob send ahead of the rest of the family of Israel to meet with Joseph, and why do you think he chose him? And then a couple things to discuss and talk about. What happened when Jacob and Joseph finally met? What did Joseph tell his father to say to Pharaoh, and why do you think this was important? And then going a little bit deeper, what is the connection between this chapter and the family of Jacob, Israel, and what we will eventually study in the book of Exodus, and why is that important? Again, passage, highlight, underline, whatever you want to do with it, but always read the passage through at least a couple times before you answer the questions. And God speaks to Jacob, also known as Israel, about moving to Egypt. Special note, you might ask the question, why sometimes in scripture does it say Jacob and other times it calls him Israel? And if we dig in a little deeper on that, we're going to find that the name Jacob is used about Jacob when the narrative is speaking about the person, or when Jacob is acting in the world. He's being worldly. Israel is used when the narrative is emphasizing his spiritual connection to God and God's covenant, or when he is acting in the spirit in line with God's covenant plan. So if you want to do a little study on that, you could go back and see how that seems to be the case in every situation where you read either his name Jacob or Israel. So just keep that in mind. It's interchangeable, but yet it kind of has a focus when it's used. So at Beersheba, where God stopped before, or where Jacob stopped before going into Egypt to sacrifice to God, God spoke to Jacob and said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also surely bring you up again. And Joseph, will close your eyes. So there's three main parts to the Abrahamic covenant that God promises Abraham: a nation, a land, and a blessing. So God is emphasizing the promise of a nation and a land here to Jacob, that part. And he is reassuring Jacob that moving to Egypt is in line with his plan and promise, because the family would be protected in Goshen and would grow to some 2 million by the time of the Exodus and return to the promised land. So in this chapter, we see Jacob sending Judah ahead. He sent Judah before him to Joseph to point out the way before him to Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. So now we see Judah was beginning to show leadership. He's being used as the leader since his previous promise to take Benjamin's place if anything went wrong. And his father Jacob recognized this, thus trusted him and gave him that role. We will eventually see the tribe of Judah down the road here in the Old Testament become the leader of the nation of Israel and produce some of the most important and powerful kings in their history, including David and Solomon. Note, don't forget, as we study and follow through these events, Judah is the carrier of the seed promise. And so the whole blessing part of the Abrahamic covenant is the promise of this Messiah. And Judah is that carrier of that seed promise that will play on down through to the time of Jesus. All right, so Jacob and Joseph finally get to meet. And in verses 29 and 30, we are told that Joseph prepared his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel. As soon as he appeared before him, he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a long time. Then Israel said to Joseph, now let me die, since I have seen your face, that you are still alive. Now, it's interesting to note, Jacob actually lives another 17 years, the text tells us, there in the land of Goshen. In verses 33 and 34, Joseph tells his father and brothers, when Pharaoh calls you and says, what is your occupation? You shall say, your servants have been keepers of livestock from our youth, even until now, both we and our fathers, that you may live in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is loathsome to the Egyptians. In other words, they detest them. They don't like them. And Joseph does this in order to protect his family from living among the Egyptians. Now, God, I'm sure, is working through Joseph to do this. There's the reason for keeping them separated that we talked about, and to fulfill God's promise of a nation that has not been compromised or assimilated. So, I mean, there is probably, I think we will see a little bit of intermixing with Egyptians with the Hebrews, but not any significant extent that would affect the nation as a whole. Making a connection now from now to Moses' time in Exodus, because this is the Joseph to Moses thing that we're talking about. And we see a few things here that happens. God is protecting the promised seed line and his covenant promise to Abraham by moving Israel out of Canaan, because, you know, they were a small group there in Canaan, and that Canaanite influence, just like he's trying to protect them from the Egyptian influence, he moves them to the land of Goshen in Egypt, where they're going to be separated. If they had stayed in Canaan, they would have blended or dissolved into the Canaanite population. Judah had already set an example of that when he went out and, you know, was involved with the Canaanites. And you could see that there already had been at least one Canaanite marriage. It tells us in verse 11, Simeon, of course, Simeon married a Canaanite woman. By moving Israel to Goshen, and by the fact that shepherds were loathed by the Egyptians, God would also be protecting his people from the Egyptians, as they would generally not be able to intermarry and disperse into that culture, keeping them from pagan practices and beliefs as well. This protection also helped fulfill the promise of a great nation that would come from Abraham. And at the beginning of the next book, Exodus, we will find that this little family of 70 has grown to over 2 million people, the nation promised by God. However, they will be enslaved by a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And this is where the story will begin when we begin to talk about Moses. All right. So that ends our review and study for this week. Search the scriptures to know the Bible. The Bible study piece is so important for you to do on your own, and not just wait for me to review answers, but to dig in and do it yourself. Again, if you're doing this a little bit behind, you could, as a leader, maybe for your group, you can use the answers that I've given to help you and guide you. And there's so much more you could probably pull out and go even deeper on these topics within each chapter. But for next week, we're going to finally get to the end of Genesis, chapters 47 to 50. So pre-do these, do a little bit of review of tonight. Particularly, we talked a lot about the Moses controversy documentary, and give some of your thoughts and maybe comments on that. And then anything that you had questions on the answers. And then get into these other questions here as you do your reading. And let me know if you have questions or concerns or comments at any time by going to the Truth, Faith, and Reason website, and you can share there. All right. Well, thank you for being here again this week, and I pray you have a blessed week, and we will see you back again next week. Bye-bye.